to spend $5.4 billion more than. Again, we are projected in the years 28 and 29 to spend more than $5.4 billion more than we collect in taxes. And this is even after our Democrat colleagues raised our taxes and fees on all Minnesotans by over $10 billion last year. So over 4 years, spending is nearly $9.5 billion more than revenue. What that demonstrates to Minnesotans is we don't have a revenue problem, we have a spending problem here in the state. We did last year do a great job of cutting state spending in last session, but our forecast, as we've seen, does show that there's a lot more work to do. And again, I want to thank MMB staff for pointing out that had we not, as legislative leaders, along with the governor, fought for spending cuts last session, the deficit would have been nearly 50% more than what it shows today. Last year, Governor Walz blamed increases in social service spending as the main driver of the deficit that was created. But we now know that much of that increase was the result of fraud. It's been pointed out that healthcare costs have increased, and that actually deserves a serious look to whether that increase is because of fraud. We've seen scandal after scandal after scandal of fraud in our social service programs on the current administration's watch. If fraud had been taken seriously, instead of dismissing the concerns and ignoring massive overruns in spending, that deficit would have been less than a third of what it is now. And likewise, if Democrats had budgeted responsibly back in 23 when we had an $18 billion surplus, instead of spending all of that and growing our government by another 40% without putting in those safeguards, we wouldn't be in this position that we're in today. We are, as it has been said by the governor, a very generous state. That doesn't mean, though, that we should sit back and turn a blind eye to when people are taking advantage of Minnesota generosity. It can't be allowed to be taken advantage of anymore. So the bottom line here is supported by this forecast information is that we have, again, both a spending problem and a fraud problem. And we will be addressing it when we return to session on February 17th. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Leader Niska for additional comments.
Thank you, Speaker Demuth. And we will take questions, and we are going to talk about the state budget. That might be a little different from the previous comments we heard from the governor. What we heard from the governor is really emblematic of the problem that Minnesota is in. We have long-term continued deficits because of bad policy from Minnesota and continued attempts to deflect from that bad policy by talking about federal policy that has nothing to do with the problems that we have to deal with in Minnesota. We're seeing reduced growth in our state economy because of the explosion in the size and scope of state government, and we're seeing increased cost at the local government level and the school district level because of the mandates that Democrats have forced on local governments and on all employers. Those are the long-term problems that we have to deal with. We need pro-growth economic policies, and we need to bring the size and scope, and most importantly, the fraud in state government under control. What we saw instead of that from the governor was someone who wants to talk about everything other than his failed policies, and in fact wants to show, again, the real reason we've gotten into this huge fraud problem in the first place. This administration, led by this governor, is more concerned about who they're offending than about actually protecting our tax dollars. And that is wrong. That's embarrassing. The governor should be embarrassed. The entire administration needs to take accountability for the problems that they have created. Those are the big long-term budget problems we have to deal with: economic growth and fraud. We heard nothing about that from the governor. Instead, we heard mostly about federal policy issues that are relevant to a job he ran for and didn't get, but not relevant to the job that he is supposed to be doing for the people of Minnesota right now. And that's a shame. To jump from spending an $18 billion surplus, raising taxes, new mandates, billions of dollars in fraud, to try to blame that all on Trump requires staggering mental gymnastics. And I should certainly hope that the people of Minnesota are tired of it and are ready to see through it. And that's what this budget forecast and the comments we heard from the governor with no questions really shows about where we're at. Hopefully, we can get a change in leadership on that front. And now I'm going to turn it over to Senator Pratt.
Well, thank you. I'm Eric Pratt. I represent Senate District 54, which is most of Scott County, and I'm the Republican lead on the Senate Finance Committee. The billions in tax increases that were implemented by the trifecta aren't enough to keep up with the out-of-control spending and fraud that we've seen from this governor and from the legislative Democrats. Look, tax collections are up. 66 billion, 67 billion, 67. Spending is up. Thank you for somebody who laughed. Spending is up, and we're still have a structural spending problem. We are still spending $2.1 billion more this biennium and $4.5 billion more next biennium. You know, I was kind of surprised to hear the governor talk about his budget because he was more interested in cutting disability services than he was rooting out and stopping fraud. And had we implemented his budget, we would have pushed billions down to our counties that would have resulted in the largest property tax increase in state history. And so the question I have is, how does higher taxes and higher spending make it more affordable for Minnesota families? And I'm happy to answer any questions along with my colleagues. Thanks.
Do you have a plan for addressing the two big drivers that MMB mentioned, you know, the continuing issue over long-term care and then healthcare costs?
And managed care costs, I'm sorry.
So as we're looking at the increased drivers and those costs as mentioned, the legislature has a lot of work to do. We have just a short session this year, and as we've seen, there is guidance given by MMB to be cautious in our spending. We do have to get a hold of what those drivers are. And again, the mandates that we have seen on our businesses affect every aspect of the business that happens here in Minnesota, including healthcare, nursing homes, and those all are put on and increasing the cost for everyone. As the legislature does its work along with our, again, we're tied in the House, and so we've got the co-chairs. As we came forward with the budget this last year, it wasn't walking into the end of negotiations with a Republican House budget and a Democrat House budget. We had a House budget worked on. That is what we'll continue to do, to look at the cost drivers and find fixes for that.
To learn that the state budget officials are not really accounting for fraud in their forecasts and in their budget documents.
Yeah, thank you for that question and that comment too. I was very surprised because fraud is something that has gone on prior to my time in the legislature when I came in 19. But as we have been raising those red flags over and over and over, it seemed to go just really ignored except for the last year and a half. So the fact that that has not been accounted for, what we know, the U.S. Assistant Attorney had said there is over $1 billion in fraud in the state of Minnesota. And yes, investigations will continue. That was also said by the U.S. Assistant Attorney's Office that that was the tip of the iceberg. So to have a state budget that didn't even nod to the fraud, that is something that I think was definitely a miss, and we have to continue looking at that. That is not, it needs to end, but we know it's been ongoing.
Madam Speaker, can you investigate and get a number on your own? Do you plan to do a parallel forecast? I mean, how do you account for the fraud that's not accounted for?
So some of the other things, and we don't know, and that's a really good point, that we don't have those total numbers in, but some of the things that we were able to get over the finish line in this last legislative session were adding 2 new FTEs, full-time equivalent employees to the OLA office, adding whistleblower protections. The thing we couldn't get over the finish line was the independent office of Inspector General. Governor Walz wanted that. He had said that if we passed a bill for an independent OIG and put it on his desk He said this during the State of the State, that he would sign it. The Senate overwhelmingly, 60 votes for it, passed it. House Democrats blocked that and would not let it through. That is one of the top things that we will look at doing, something the governor has been on record saying that he wants. That's one of the top things. Is that going to handle the deficit that we know is upcoming? Probably not right away in the way that we need it to, but it sure is a step in the right direction to get more accountability and end the fraud. We don't have to cancel out all programs. That's not what we want to do. We want to cancel the fraudsters from taking advantage of tax dollars here in the state of Minnesota.
The president has called Somalis in the state garbage. I'm wondering what you say to people who are hurting and who are fearful in the wake of those comments. And as we move forward, and as a state, as lawmakers try to take a more pragmatic and assertive stance on fraud, how do you disentangle the bread and butter of that work from the very heated and xenophobic national debate about immigration policy?
When we have record fraud in the state of Minnesota, if this had been taken care of early on, rather than here we are 7 years into this administration and it's been running wild, we wouldn't even be having this conversation at this time. But I will tell you that in no way do I believe any community is all bad, just like I don't believe any community is all good. What we need to do is hold the fraudsters in any community accountable for their actions and stop it here in the state of Minnesota. Go ahead.
Would you condemn the president's comments, though, calling them garbage?
Here's the thing. As we look forward, we need to get rid of fraudsters. They are the criminals. That is what we need to do. Anyone that is committing fraud in the state of Minnesota, and it is proven, that is criminal activity, and it needs to end.
Can you speak to directly the Somali community, the Somali American community? I mean, many of them, as Ernesto mentioned, are hurting. Do you agree with the president? I mean, do you agree with his comments that Somalis shouldn't be living here?
What I will say is we have a wonderful state with people that are actively a part of making Minnesota even better than what we know. What I will say, though, is there is not an entire community that is bad, and there's not an entire community that is good. We have seen reports, KARE 11, we've seen reports, Star Tribune has reported, where there are Somali Americans saying we need to get to the bottom of this. This is hurting us all. That's what I support, is getting to the bottom of the fraud, holding those causing fraud and doing fraud in the state of Minnesota, holding them accountable.
Senator Mohammed said she reached out to Republican lawmakers and asked them to be present at the event yesterday condemning the rhetoric on Somalis. Is there a reason that Republican lawmakers weren't at that event? Do you guys have a response to that?
I have not had a chance to talk to the senator specifically about this. I don't have an answer specifically for that. I didn't receive that invitation directly. Any other questions?
Do you have any thoughts on how DHS is conducting its fraud investigations?
What we know is DHS specifically, there is record fraud that has been pointed out there. So how they are conducting their fraud investigations, I can't answer that for you. That would be a great question for the governor or the commissioner.
You address the politics ahead in session. You want the governor's job. How is it going to be working?
I am here as Speaker of the House. We're talking about the budget for the state of Minnesota going forward. When we return to the legislative session on February 17th, we have much work to do. I've already mentioned the OIG bill that couldn't quite get over the finish line that we need to take another look at. We now know that we are headed in a deficit worse than what we actually thought. There are financial constraints that we have to do. The legislature has a lot of work ahead of us, and we're going to be ready to do that together. Again, as Speaker Emerita Hortman said, Team House. In a tie, we are Team House. That's the way we're going to be working this next year.
I anticipate it could be difficult, though, with the two of you running for the same office during session.
You know, the entire, every constitutional officer, office, the governor, every single seat in the House and the Senate is up for election. I think what you're going to see from the legislature this year is that everyone is running for their reelection or for some office. And I think that's an important thing to acknowledge. We have the legislative work to do for the people of Minnesota starting February 17th and getting our work done for the people of Minnesota.
Speaker, hi. Do Republicans intend to discuss like a supplemental budget to try to maybe propose further cuts to get at that future deficit, even though you don't have to pass any budget or spending plan this year?
As we go forward into that session, I know that lawmakers are looking at different bills, different proposals. In the House with the tie, we have co-chairs. And as you remember, before anything can move in those committees, we have the ability for our Democrat co-chairs to preside over a meeting, and then the next one goes to Republicans. We alternate that way. But in order for anything to pass, it has to be bipartisan. So that work has been going forward. It will continue throughout the legislative session.
Make sure I'm understanding correctly the interplay between the budget numbers and the forecast and some of the fraudulent spending that we've seen or that may come up. Because the programs that are being targeted that we know about, aren't those largely programs like it's like Medicaid reimbursements? There's like federal money passing through, and the state is implementing it, obviously. There are some costs for the state. But isn't some of this federal funds that's being...
So a lot of the money is federal funds, but we are responsible for managing those programs. And what we've seen is just a lack of concern, a lack of effort for trying to stop that fraud. This administration hasn't stopped any fraud. It's all come from the U.S. Attorney so far. And I think it's interesting that the governor is criticizing the Secretary of Homeland Security for not knowing her numbers. He's been working on this for 2 years. He doesn't know the numbers yet. So I think there is, and it goes beyond just the Medicare fraud, but even as we talk about it, the legislative auditor found multiple cases where DHS wasn't following state law to recoup those monies that had gone out erroneously. And that is just a complete oversight by what we've seen from the administration and not even following current law.
Would you address the president's rhetoric aimed at Somalis? You yourself were just at Mar-a-Lago, so you may have more insight to Speaker Game.
Well, he wasn't there, so I didn't get a chance to talk to him. But look, I agree with Speaker Damath. I don't want to condemn any community in its entirety, just as I never would. It wasn't said the way that I would have said it. But what I will say is I share the president's frustration in the amount of fraud and corruption that's effectively gone in the state. I mean, it's really put a black eye on this state. And we are in the national news for all the wrong reasons. I guess what I would say to that is, I'm sorry, I lost my train of thought. We just need to get our house back in order. We need to start putting the focus on the place where it needs to be, and that's really stopping fraud. What we saw from the governor was trying to back away from what the story is today, and that is the fact that we are facing a $4.5 billion budget deficit. Plain and simple, and it could have been much, much worse had we not taken the steps from before. And so I'm here to talk about the budget deficit, but I certainly, do want to say that I agree with the speaker. We should never be condemning a community in its entirety.
Senator, yeah. Are you concerned about the president's description of Minnesota as a hellhole? How helpful is that to what you're trying to do with the budget and everything else?
Oh, for God's sakes, it's 10 below out. Gee, money. No, I'm just kidding. It's not a hellhole, but we are in the news for all the wrong reasons. We are in the news because we have not been able to control the fraud and corruption that's going on in this state. And quite honestly, whether it's and the incompetence of the administration to stop it. I've worked in fraud prevention for 10 years. And I know that there are some very basic things that can be done to stop this type of fraud. And we've seen, I think all of your stations and outlets have covered the fact that the administration has not done the very basic steps to ensure that the monies are being spent and being utilized in a way that we're being told. They're not going out and doing site visits. They're not looking at the the exponential increases in spending and for some of these programs and asking questions why. And that to me seems to be the most basic thing that the administration should have been doing.
Take one more. We heard the governor just say that if you do not, or if elected officials do not explicitly condemn the rhetoric coming from the national, the president about Somalis in Minnesota, that you're complicit in it. Can you respond to that?
You know, all I can say is what my values are. My values are that that's not the way I would say it. I don't agree with the way it was described by the president. However, I share his frustration, and you know, everybody reacts in different ways. I think we're just basically talking about semantics here, but nobody on the Republican side, I think, has come out in support of what the president said. And in fact, many have, and some of us are, putting out statements to that very fact, to say that we understand that you can't just lump an entire community into one description. And we all have Somalis that live in our district. They're our neighbors, our friends, and you know, that's how we work down in Scott County, and that's how I expect to work going forward.
Unless anyone has anything else before I ask.
Yeah, I also just wanted to add, all three of us disagree with the idea of lumping or describing people based on group identity. What the president probably got more wrong, though, is that the unique problem of Minnesota isn't immigrants or refugees. Every state has immigrants and refugees. The reason Minnesota has a unique fraud problem is because we have a uniquely incompetent administration overseeing these programs. That's the real problem. It's the incompetence and lack of leadership at the top that's caused all of this to happen. If Governor Walz and his folks had actually watched the store and prevented the fraud from happening in the first place, we wouldn't be talking about any of this. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good afternoon. Erin Murphy, Senate Majority Leader. I want to be very clear that listening to a president refer to people in the disparaging ways that this